right, the Grave Creek Mound Archaeological Complex is home to West Virginia's first archaeological collections management facility. Prior to 2008, there was never a designated repository. It took a number of years and the efforts of many people to make this a reality. Maryland has played a distant but important role in the development of West Virginia's collections management facility. The Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory helped to serve as an inspiration and a vision on how West Virginia developed its own facility. The influence and cooperation and support from Maryland continues to this day. It is with great privilege that I introduce today's keynote speaker, Rebecca J. Morehouse. Becky holds a BA in Anthropology and English from State University of New York at Geneseo, and an MA in Anthropology with the concentration in Museum Studies from George Washington University. She is currently the Curator of State Collections at the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory, a post she has held since 2002. Prior to this position, Becky was the Curator of the Maryland State Highway Administration collections, which are also housed at the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory. She has also served in collections management and lab intern roles at the New York State Museum, Alexandria Archaeology Museum, Ford's Theater National Historic Site, and the Macaulay Complex Archaeological Research Laboratory, and the National Park Service on a NAGPRA team. Becky is active on national and regional levels, giving presentations and writing on various aspects of collections management. At this time, please welcome Rebecca J. Morehouse. Becky?
Here's hoping there's no more technological glitches. I really feel privileged to have been asked to be the keynote speaker. I have to say that's a first for me. So I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be asked to be here today, particularly after sitting through the morning's sessions and listening to the different panelists that have already spoken today. So I feel like I'm in really good company, and I really appreciate it. I've done my best to sort of squeeze into an hour, or really less than an hour, sort of an overview of the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory, which I will call the MAC Lab from here on out because it's too long a name to repeat over and over again, as well as a little bit on Jefferson, Patterson Park and Museum, that I will refer to affectionately as Jeff Pat through the rest of the presentation, because again, it's just too long a name. I'm not sure what they were thinking when they came up with that. But I mainly want to focus on one of the primary missions, if not the primary mission of the MAC Lab, which is collections accessibility. And what we've gone through to make the state of Maryland's collections as accessible as possible, while still trying to promote long-term preservation. And then I'll sort of touch on some of our struggles and challenges as you'll always run into with any state facility. But before I get into the details on the MAC Lab, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Jeff Pat and how the MAC Lab ended up on this 500-acre plus piece of property down in southern Maryland, rather than in one of Maryland's urban centers, I should say the two urban centers, Annapolis or Baltimore City. In the early 20th century, the property that was to become Jeff Pat was owned by Jefferson and Mary Marvin Breckinridge Patterson, and the property was known as Point Farm. Jefferson Patterson was a career diplomat, as well as heir to the National Cash Register fortune. And Mrs. Patterson was the granddaughter of B.F. Goodrich, and after attending Vassar College, went on to become one of Edward R. Murrow's boys during World War II. And here's a picture of her broadcasting from Berlin. Point Farm, which spanned over 500 acres, was Mr. Patterson's hobby farm, where he raised his prize Black Angus cattle. The brick building in the color photo here now houses the Jeff Pat Visitor Center, but it was originally built for Mr. Patterson's cattle. It was the show barn where he showed off his cattle. And the building in the black and white photo in the background, which was originally a barn and stable, has been transformed into the Jeff Pat Pavilion, which can be rented out for weddings and other events. And the museum uses that area primarily for their events as well. So where does archaeology come in? The Pattersons had several tenants that lived on the property, and one of them was Lana Brown, who you'll see here on your left. She began collecting artifacts that had been eroding out of the bank along the Patuxent River. Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum is the Patuxent River runs along its western shore. And then in the early 1980s, she brought these artifacts to the attention of archaeologists at the Southern Maryland Regional Center, which was an archaeological research facility or research program in Southern Maryland. And this then led to an archaeological survey of the property, which identified dozens of archaeological sites. And to date, there's been over 70 sites identified and recorded at Jeff Pat, which span about 8,000 years. So archaeologists, along with the State Historic Preservation Office in Annapolis, began negotiations with Mrs. Patterson, because Mr. Patterson had passed away in 1977. So they began negotiations with Mrs. Patterson to try to get the property donated to the state. And in 1983, they were successful. So we like to tell the story of sort of hold Lana Brown up as an example of doing the right thing. You know, she was finding all these artifacts, and rather than just sort of taking them for herself or, you know, putting them on her mantle, she found the local archaeologists and talked to them. And essentially that is what led to the donation of this 500-plus acre farm and turned it into an archaeological preserve and essentially the State Museum of Archaeology. And even Mrs. Patterson, in the deed signing ceremony in 1983, she specifically said that this was the greatest gift that is in my power to give, and I give it willingly to the state of Maryland because of the archaeology, which is pretty awesome when you think about it. So where does the Mac Lab come in? The Maryland SHPO had been thinking about an archaeological collections repository since the late 1970s, but there really hadn't been anywhere to put it at that time. But that all changed when Mrs. Patterson donated her property. So in the mid-1980s, planning for the Mac Lab finally began in earnest. And after over a decade of planning, the state finally saw its dream of a state-of-the-art archaeological repository and conservation lab realized when it opened the Mac Lab in 1998. The Mac Lab serves as the repository for the majority of the archaeological collections either owned by or in the custody of the state. And through its 3 programs of research, curation, and conservation, it is committed to study, conserve, curate, and make accessible an estimated 7 to 8 million artifacts and their associated documentation. Located in a relatively rural and isolated area of Calvert County, Maryland, the Mac Lab was designed to mimic a cluster of tobacco barns on the landscape, and to blend in, quote unquote, with the neighboring 1930s colonial revival farm managers complex that Mr. Patterson had built to support his hobby farm. And these buildings here are part of that 1930s complex. But when viewed from above, at 38,000 square feet, it's obvious that the lab dwarfs anything else on the landscape. And while the Mac Lab's design has won numerous architectural awards, it didn't take long to discover that while it was a beautiful addition to the rural landscape, the design was less than perfect when it came to environmental controls. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that later. It's been one of our challenges, controlling the environment in a space design such as that. The creation of this facility brought together 3 previously independent state programs. The Southern Maryland Regional Center, the research program that I had already spoken about, and the conservation and curation programs. And the merger of these 3 programs to form one institution was not without its challenges. It required research archaeologists, conservators, and curators to work cooperatively and create one of the first state-of-the-art facilities solely focused on research and preservation of archaeological collections. The Mac Lab also has an educational mission. We provide behind-the-scenes tours of the lab on the first Friday of every month, usually given by a staff member, and then every Thursday we have docent-led tours. The MAC staff also participates in outreach programs for school children and hosts the annual Discovering Archaeology Day every April during Archaeology Month, which includes lab tours and archaeology site tours, as well as helping the general public identify any artifacts they may have found. And the research program also takes the lead on our public archaeology program, which runs from May to June every year, where we open up current archaeological excavations to public participation. And it allows the public to participate in all aspects of field and lab activities. And for several years, we've been excavating an 18th century plantation site on the property, and we'll be out there until the end of this June. So if anybody finds themselves over in Calvert County, in southern Calvert County, please stop by, and maybe you can find a spot in a screen and screen for some artifacts. Now, prior to the creation of the MAC Lab, the state's archaeological collections were stored in a variety of less than adequate storage locations, usually state-owned surplus spaces, which included the old Hall of Records, Maryland's Department of Parole and Probation, and its last location before moving to the MAC Lab was the Spring Grove Psychiatric Hospital. Some state-owned collections were even stored in the self-storage facilities with no climate controls whatsoever, and others still were in private residences, usually the home of the archaeologist who had conducted the excavations. Collections were stored in non-archival acidic cardboard boxes, usually liquor or fruit boxes, sometimes cigarette cases, in non-climate controlled spaces, which unfortunately had been the standard practice for archaeological collections for decades. Oops. The MAC Lab provided much improved storage conditions in its 2-story collection storage room. It has compactable shelving, which essentially doubles the amount of usable storage space that you'll get with stationary shelving. And the shelving that's in the MAC Lab holds just over 10,000 boxes, and we have somewhere in the vicinity of about 8,000 now, so we're slowly filling up after 15 years. It also had additional space for cabinets to house study collections, those diagnostic artifacts that researchers are most likely to want to come and access, as well as providing space for large oversized objects. However, just moving the collections into the MAC Lab, while it was a good first step, it was really far from the final solution to Maryland's curation crisis. Many of the collections were still in acidic and deteriorating boxes and bags. So rehousing collections became a top priority for staff and interns and the occasional volunteer. But just making sure that the collections were archivally stable wasn't enough either. When the lab opened, the then director, Dr. Julie King, was adamant that one of the primary missions of the MAC Lab, along with long-term preservation, should be collections accessibility. And as a research archaeologist herself, she knew the challenges of trying to conduct research on collections if you didn't know what was in them. So if accessibility was going to become a primary mission, we first needed to determine just what was in the state's collections. And we had a basic idea of some of the sites we had. We had a semi-usable collections inventory database that kind of gave us an idea of the number of boxes we had per site. But that was really about it. So Dr. King came up with this great idea of applying to the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding to try to make some of the more significant collections that we had more accessible. So knowing that we couldn't tackle all, at the time, probably about 5,000 boxes of artifacts, we decided to, the MacLab staff decided to reach out to the archaeological community and to help us to participate in choosing what we thought were some of the more significant collections in the MacLab collections. So a committee of staff archaeologists and outside colleagues chose collections with the greatest potential for future, what we considered future use, which was either research, study, or exhibition. And this collaborative effort resulted in the selection of collections from 34 archaeological sites, ranging from the Paleo-Indian period to the early 20th century, and from Western Maryland to the state's eastern shore, so that all time periods and regions of the state were represented. And this schematic here just sort of shows you the different counties and the sites that we chose. So through a series of NEH grants, these collections were either cataloged, recatalogued, or had their catalogs spot checked, depending on how good they were. And the artifact inventories were entered into a computer database, and the field records and photo documentation were scanned. And so MAC staff then spent time preparing the collections for cataloging. So we spent a lot of time rehousing, and conservation, conservators worked on conserving a select number of significant and diagnostic objects from these sites. And that time was used as match for the NEH grants. The NEH grants also funded the creation of a finding aid for each collection, which is on the Jeff Pat website under Archaeological Collections in Maryland, which includes a description of the site and the artifacts as well as the records. There are site maps also, as well as a select number of artifact photos from each site. And as I said, there's also, we digitized all the field records, reports, and images from these sites, also with funding from NEH. And these can also be found on the Jeff Pat website. And from the finding aid, you can click and you can get a list of the thumbnails of all of the field records. And then if you click on an individual field record, you can get more detail. And then again, if you click, you can bring up a larger image of the actual document. So these NEH grants were excellent because they sort of got us started, but it only tackled about 25% of what we had in the state's collections. So we were sort of left with, what do we do with the remaining 75%? Because there were still several collections that sort of didn't make the cut when we were going through and deciding what sites to include in these grant projects. So it became clear that what we really needed to do was go through the collections and do a box-by-box inventory, and to just, from beginning to end, just make sure that we knew exactly what was in each box, just what sites we had. And it was quite an overwhelming task, I have to say. When I realized that that's what I had to do, I was depressed for a few days, and then and then I thought, well, this is cool. This will be a way for me to really get to know our collections, exactly what we have, because I discovered through this process there were sites I didn't even realize we had. I knew nothing about. So it was really good for me when I came on as curator in 2002. And I probably started this box-by-box inventory process a couple of years after that. It really helped me get to know the collections. So what we did is the contents of each box was inventoried, and now not down to the artifact level, because I'd still be doing it if we did it that way. I wanted to at least just get a good inventory of the sites and the projects that we had, and know where they were in collection storage. So then the next phase will be to make sure absolutely everything is rehoused, and then start working our way through collections that haven't been cataloged. So in some cases we were able to, as we were doing this box by box inventory, in some cases we were able to rehouse the collections if they were smaller collections. But if they were too large, we just sort of added them to a list of collections that we'll need to go back to. And then some of the smaller projects, I mean, sometimes we would just have a handful of artifacts from, you know, a phase 1 or something, and they had all sort of been stored in boxes all mixed together, and it was sort of hard to find them. So we came up with a system of each unique project got its own little box, so we could then store a bunch, you know, a large number of different projects in a box, but still be able to find them. So that's what you see there on the left. We also made sure each collection was accessioned. And I was really surprised to discover that probably about only 60% of what we had was accessioned, and including some of the sites that we had highlighted for those NEH grants that we'd spent all this time on. Some of them didn't have accession files. We knew we had them because they were such large collections, you couldn't miss them. But they didn't actually have a file. So we made sure that that we now have a file with sort of the detail of all the project information and the box information in a filing cabinet in the collections file room. The collection information then, after we went through and we did this box by box inventory, the collection information was then entered into the Archaeological Collections inventory database, which strictly records the site and project information, and show you there the site and project information, and then box information, but not, like, again, not down to the artifact level. It just sort of has the provenience information. We have a lot number system. I'm not sure if you guys do here in West Virginia, where one single number is assigned to a unique provenience. So then when we label the artifacts, all you have to do is label that number, and you go to a catalog and you can see what the provenience is. And then the basic contents, whether it's just general artifacts, brick, shell, and then the address and storage. This, like I said, this doesn't go down to the artifact. It's not an artifact inventory database, and I'll talk about that later, because that's also another one of our challenges. So it took me about 7 years. When I say curation staff, it was me. I'm more or less it. I do have a collections assistant, but she didn't come into this process till a few years in. So it was primarily just me going through and inventorying the collections. And if we include all the NEH sites, we had about 7,000 boxes with 4,300 sites and 1,800 projects that were recorded. So along with the box by box inventory, curation staff and interns and volunteers continue to create study collections for those sites that we think have the most research value. There's that theme of collections accessibility, research value, you know, wanting people to use the collections and make them accessible for researchers. And as we continue to rehouse and upgrade collections, we create microenvironments with the desiccant silica gel wherever possible for metal artifacts. Now, metal artifacts in particular are most susceptible to those moisture and swings in relative humidity. So since we do have some issues with swings in relative humidity, particularly in the summer, we've decided that all metal artifacts are going into these microenvironments. And we have two systems. One, which you see here, is a Rubbermaid container. We use these for study collections because they're really easy to access. You have to change the silica gel more often, but that's okay, and because it allows for easier access to the collections. But objects that we think aren't going to be accessed that often, you know, like those boxes and boxes of nails and things that we do keep, we create a triple bag Ziploc system with silica gel and these little indicator cards here that show us sort of a general idea of what the relative humidity is within the microenvironment. And we've discovered that the triple bag system can actually last for years if it's not opened. And even if the little strip here, or these little, you see the little blue dots in with the silica gel, that's an indicator, which essentially changes from blue to pink as it absorbs more and more moisture. Even if that's starting to turn pink, and this is showing that maybe the relative humidity is creeping up a little bit, we've still discovered that having these microenvironments really creates a buffer from when you're having swings in relative humidity in your storage space. So it still protects the artifact. So, because we're not on a system yet where we're going through kind of like the Brooklyn Bridge where you finish painting it and you have to start painting it again. That's pretty much what you have to do with silica gel. We need to set up a system where we're putting, because you can regenerate this right in the lab with an oven. You can just dry it out and reuse it. But we haven't gotten to the point yet where we can go through and change out the silica gel, which we could think is potentially exhausted. The oversized objects in the collections, we have about 300 or so. Most of them still need to be rehoused and conserved and have microenvironments created where necessary. The associated field records for the state's collections, they've all been rehoused into acid-free folders and archival document boxes. The oversized maps are stored in rolled storage in these telescoping document tubes. And we have acid-free copies for most of them. We still have many more acid-free copies to make of the field records. Are actually stored in a separate building at Jeff Pat. We didn't want them in the same building as the Mac Lab, just in case if something was to happen at the Mac Lab, we don't want to lose everything. So it's stored in a separate location. And the digital media that we receive is transferred, things like digital photos and artifact inventories and the like are stored on the networks, our network shared drives, and the CDs and DVDs are stored in archival cases in the collections file room. But the handling of digital media has really become one of our greatest challenges, and I'm going to touch on that in a little bit towards the end. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about conservation. As part of the rehousing and collections inventory process, many of the objects that were in need of conservation were identified, and we're lucky enough at the Mac Lab to just down the hall in another wing, I have access to 2 conservators that can work on the state collections, and then we have 2 other conservators that are contract conservators that do outside work. But if I find something in the collections, I'm lucky enough to just be able to walk down the hall and say, help. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the conservation program and what they do. The Mac Lab Conservation Facility was custom designed for archaeological conservation, keeping in mind the nature of the state's collections as well as the opportunity for significant marine and terrestrial finds throughout the state. And for this reason, it's one of the few labs in the country that can handle objects like large waterlogged timbers, like this dugout canoe that was discovered on Maryland's eastern shore, as well as cannon from the U.S. Navy. We treat lots of cannon for the Navy, particularly because we're not far from the Naval Historical Center in Washington, D.C., so we have a good relationship with them in terms of they pay us to conserve a lot of their artifacts. But even more delicate objects like glass, smaller objects from sites throughout the state. The main conservation lab has a 5-ton crane, which runs the length of the lab and allows conservators to safely handle objects weighing hundreds and thousands of pounds. And here you can see some of the conservators and me pretending I'm a conservator when I had shorter hair, moving some timbers into treatment. The conservation program also has an industrial X-ray unit which can help with the identification of heavily corroded objects, and as well as helping conservators see the interior structure, even if they sort of know what the object is. Like here, for example, this is a wagon wheel from Alexandria Archaeology. They were able to just kind of get an idea of sort of what some of the interior structure of the object was before the conservators started work on it. And this is a perfect example of one of those sort of unidentifiable corroded iron objects that will come out of an archaeological site, and you're like, okay, it doesn't look like much. And a conservator could just start working on this, not knowing if there's anything really in there worth saving. So this is where an X-ray comes in. So when we X-rayed it, it showed a really intricately detailed cast iron stove door. And so this is a perfect example of why having an X-ray is so awesome, because then the conservator could then use the X-ray as a guide as she's cleaning, so she knows what's in there. You know, she's not going in blind. The lab also has 2 freeze dryers. One really large one, obviously for things like the large ship timbers that I just showed you previously, as well as a smaller one for smaller objects. Freeze dryers are primarily used for treating waterlogged wood, and we're one of the few labs in the country, and certainly on the East Coast, that has one as large as this one here. And so we tend to be the lab that the conservation facility that most people go to if they have to deal with large waterlogged objects. Now, conservators, I'm not a conservator, so this is going to be sort of a quick and dirty description of what we do with waterlogged wood when you receive it. Like, you can't just let it dry out, right? You think of a sponge on your sink. After you've used it, you let it dry out, it gets all sort of warped and shrinks. And you certainly don't want to do that with any objects that come out of an archaeological site. You know, the point is to try to preserve them as well as you can. So for waterlogged wood in particular, conservators will soak it in something called polyethylene glycol. And what that does is it sort of absorbs into the wood, and it helps sort of support the internal structure, the cell walls of the wood. And then the wood is for a specific period of time. Conservators have their little calculations. They figure out based on object by object how long something needs to soak for. And so then it'll be frozen and put in a freeze dryer. And when they pull the vacuum in the freeze dryer, essentially takes the water from a solid to a gas, because it's the liquid phase of water that really can cause the damage to the cell walls. So that helps keep the shape of the wood. So somebody figured that out. And so that's one of the main reasons we use the freeze dryer. Although it's also been used, we've been hired by libraries that have had floods, or institutions where their archives have been flooded, and we usually tell them as soon as they call us, get it into a freezer as fast as possible, and then get it to us as fast as possible, and we can freeze dry it, and it will remove the water in sort of as safe a way as possible, and not and reduce the shrinkage and warping that you would get if you just let it dry out on its own. And you can also use them for pest eradication. We've done that if we've had soil samples or things that we're not quite sure if they might be infested with some sort of insects. So a few rounds through a freeze dryer will take care of most insects. So I've just showed you what we call the main conservation lab. It's the big dirty lab. But then we have something called the finishing lab. And this is where artifacts go for mount and box building, reassembling and mending. It's a cleaner area. They still use some chemicals in this area, but the bulk of the dirty conservation treatments are done in the main lab, and this is a cleaner space. So the primary mission of the conservation program is to support the MAC Lab's research and curation programs by treating the objects. And then, like I sort of touched upon, the secondary mission is to provide conservation services as a revenue-generating operation. Because we're a state facility, we are funded by the state, but If they think that we can make money in any way at all, they want us to. And since we are one of the few facilities on the East Coast and in the United States that can handle this level of conservation, you know, it would be crazy for us not to have a revenue-generating part of our program. So other state agencies and federal agencies, nonprofit institutions, archaeological consultants all hire us to do conservation. So we've had objects come from Alaska, California, Florida, all up and down the East Coast. We've been hired to conserve objects. So all of this rehousing and inventorying and conservation, again, is primarily to support the two missions of preservation and accessibility. As we slowly got a grip on our collections, it allowed us to preserve some of the more significant objects in the collections, but it also allowed our staff to make the collections more accessible in a variety of ways, one of which was through our webpage. The Diagnostic Artifacts in Maryland webpage, which I think is probably one of the best things the Mac Lab has ever done, was originally created in 2002 with a grant from the National Center for Preservation, Technology, and Training, or NCPTT. They funded the prehistoric page, ceramics page, as well as the colonial ceramics page. Now, it's been about 11 years since we started these two pages, so we've started to go through and go through the different wares and are updating where there might be new literature or new findings or things that we didn't get around to during the first grant. So we've started to make some changes to that. But over the last several years, we've added small finds. And I say we, that's the royal we, it's not me. It's Sarah Rivers Cofield, seen here on the right, in the lower right. She has an obsession with small metal objects. And she's got a little more time. She's responsible for about 10% of the collections, and her job specifically says she needs to do research. So she's able to spend time doing research on small finds. And to date, she started out with leather ornaments, which are ornaments for leather. And which is one is right here. And this is actually from a well in Prince George's County, Maryland, and it still has some leather. It's hard to see, but right in the back here, there's some leather that survived. But she started out with leather ornaments. They're primarily horse-related somehow. And then she went on to do things like cufflinks and religious medals and bridle bosses, which go on attached to bits on horses. Things like bodkins, which are needles that were probably used for either lacing corsets or a woman's hair, putting lace or ribbons and things in hair. So she's slowly been adding metal objects. And then Patricia Sanford, our new director, she's been with the lab now almost 6 years. She's added, I think you might be able to see there's marbles. So we're sort of branching out away from the metal objects. But Sarah, I assume anything else that she adds is going to be metal, because that's what her obsession is. And speaking of Dr. Sanford, when Tricia was hired, she was looking for, okay, she wanted to do a big project when she first got to the Mac Lab. And we had been asked for many years, we had put colonial ceramics up. They were like, post-colonial ceramics, we really need stuff beyond the 18th century. And she was a perfect person to do it. It's one of her areas of expertise. And so she got some money from the Maryland Historical Trust and got George Miller, who was also a post-colonial ceramics guru, to come down for a summer, and they spent all summer essentially getting this page off the ground. And over the years now, she's since added more and more typewares to it. But now having a post-colonial ceramic component, it's made this page much more relevant to people beyond, sort of the Chesapeake and New England. So that's been a great addition. And for those of you who have seen or may have picked up our Maryland Archaeology Month poster that I brought, about 50, I think there's still a few left out there. We just added projectile points. And we did this in about February, and when Charlie Hall realized that, okay, yes, we're putting it out live. He's like, this is what we need to do for Archaeology Month. So we created the poster as well as the booklet, which sort of is a real, it doesn't have all of the types in it that we have on our webpage, but it's still a really good cheat sheet to have with you if you find a projectile point and you need help identify it. And I hope in my spare time, I don't get a lot of spare time for research, I really want to add tobacco pipes, but tobacco pipes are a huge category. And when I said, yeah, I think I'll do tobacco pipes, Sarah said, what are you thinking? And the learning curve, there's quite a learning curve there. I only know enough to be confused right now. So it's going to take a while, but I'm going to keep at it. And so hopefully eventually that'll be one of the next categories we add to it. And so as we've been adding photographs to the website of all of these different artifact types, we've been creating type collections in the main archaeology lab within the MAC lab. So for every artifact that is on the website, it's in a drawer in what is called the archaeological range, but it's essentially the archaeology lab within the archaeology lab. So any individual object, if somebody sees it online and they want to be able to come in and actually look at that specific object, it's really easy to access. So another way, another project that we did to try to make the collections more accessible to the public was something that was called the County Archaeology Collections Exhibit Project. Not very eloquent title, but we called it CASE for short. And this was, we applied to, got a grant from Preserve America to do this pilot project. And the reason we did this was there's this misconception, and I guess if people really believe it, I guess it doesn't matter if it's a misconception, that artifacts were coming into the MAC lab and they were never going to leave again. Sort of had this vision of that, the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, the big government warehouse, everything goes in, never comes out again. And we tried to figure out what can we do to sort of dispel this myth, because we had 40 to 50 loans of artifacts out from around the state and different institutions on display. People that had come to us, it was a passive program. People would come to us if they wanted artifacts. We didn't go out searching for people who would want to display our artifacts. But we decided, okay, we'll make an attempt. We'll actually be a little more proactive about this. So we applied for a grant. And so it was primarily the director, Patricia Sanford, and myself, and 2 staff members from the Maryland Historical Trust, Charlie Hall, and the head of the Museum Services Program, Mary Alexander. We got together to create this project. And essentially what we did is we focused on 2 counties, one county in southern Maryland, St. Mary's County, and one in north central Maryland, Washington County. And we created 2 traveling exhibits that discussed the importance of archaeology and why archaeologists do what they do. It also highlighted 3 sites from within the county, and so we displayed artifacts from those 3 sites, along with a description of the individual sites and what those sites had taught us about human history and the history of that particular county. And they were all displayed in this sort of exhibit case here that was on wheels, so it was fairly easy you could pretty much bring it in and set it up in, like 10 minutes. And we discovered in St. Mary's, we primarily focused on libraries. In Washington County, it was sort of a more diverse number of locations different types of institutions it went to. Libraries were by far the best because you've got so many different people coming through an average day. The librarians loved it because they pulled out all their archaeology books and put them on display next to the exhibit. So it was really a win-win. We felt like we reached the widest variety of people by being in the libraries. And in doing Washington County, it was still, we still considered it a success, but it was different. It was in some historical societies, and actually now it's at Fort Frederick State Park. They were only supposed to go to 2 or 3 different locations, but once people started seeing it from other institutions, they've been asking for it to, so we've more than fulfilled the grant about a year or so ago. But at least in Washington County, we're still moving it around. And as long as it holds up and doesn't fall apart on us, we'll just continue to move it. And Fort Frederick sounds like they want it for at least a year. But I'll show you just sort of these are the banners that we had, 2 collapsible banners that went on, whoops, wrong button, that went on either side that just sort of asked answered the basic questions of what is archaeology, and where do you know where to dig? How do you dig so slow? Why do you dig so slowly? All these things that the public asks us, as well as a panel that talked about what happens to the artifacts once they're out of the ground. Because you all here might have you have an understanding of archaeology. Most of you here, even if you're just a member of the public, you have an interest in archaeology, and you probably know that for every day in the field, there's 3 to 4 days in the lab, but a lot of people don't realize that. They think archaeology is all about digging, and I see my role and my job is to constantly remind people that there's a lot of lab work, there's a lot of work after the fact that needs to get done. So it might be fun to be out in the field, and be the first the first person to find something in a screen, but there's so much more to be done with just the basic lab work of like washing and labeling, but then cataloging and analysis and conservation, and also once a site is analyzed once, it doesn't mean that that's the final. Just because one archaeologist analyzed it doesn't mean that's the final say. So, we find that archaeologists come back to sites again and again and again, and as they find new questions to ask. And here's just a picture of some of the up close of the drawers that we had for these exhibits. We had one site which was a seasonal camp. This is in Washington County, a seasonal Native American seasonal camp where Native Americans went to collect rhyolite, essentially, for tool making. So, and we talk a little bit about the archaeologists did neutron activation analysis to try to figure out lithic source, the lithic sourcing, where they were getting the rhyolite from, if they could find the actual quarry, as well as blood residue analysis. And what I really liked about this site in particular is this point here, it's kind of, we have some images here, it's sort of hard to see, tested positive for cat. So we had cat, rabbit, and deer that blood that was identified on those objects. So people found that pretty interesting. We did a 19th century site where we just focused on the ceramics because there were some of these local redware, slipware vessels that the archaeologists who excavated this site felt that these here in particular kind of gave us an idea of who was living at the site, that they were potentially Pennsylvania German, of a Pennsylvania German heritage. A lot of the local redware potters at the time in this area were of the same heritage. So we sort of told that story. And then we couldn't not do Fort Frederick, which is one of the few fort sites in Maryland and that still stands and is a state park, and hence why this exhibit has ended up at Fort Frederick now. So these traveling exhibits essentially were kind of a traveling version of our FAQ archaeology exhibit at the Jeff Pat Visitor Center. The frequently asked questions. When we were originally planning an archaeology exhibit, we sort of were going round and round. We really wanted to make something that was very publicly accessible. And we just thought about what people constantly ask us every time they come and either visit an archaeology site or they come to the lab. And so we decided to just address all of those same questions of, what is archaeology? How do you know where to dig? Why do you dig so slowly? All of those sorts of questions. We also put in a whole wall here of drawers, one for each county. So there's an archaeological collection displayed just like I showed you previously that we had in the traveling exhibit. So if somebody comes from anywhere in the state, they can see artifacts from their county. it might just be one small site that we highlighted, but they can see something. And we also put in what we called 3 case studies, but again, it was like, how are these artifacts telling us a particular story? So we focused on 3 sites for that. Now, I've spoken about the online resources as well as the public exhibits that we have created to make the collections more accessible. But we also accommodate about 15 to 20 researchers a year that want to come in and actually work with the collections. Although this year we're already at like 15. So I don't know, for whatever reason this year research has picked up, which is a good thing. So hopefully that will continue, because I feel like it makes my job more relevant if I'm not just rehousing things and putting them on a shelf to be preserved. But to me, if nobody's actually coming to use them, then I feel like what am I doing this for? So it makes me feel good to have researchers come and use the collections. And the Mac Lab actually designed a specific room for visiting researchers so they can have their own space, sort of can close the door, they can have their own quiet space to work, which I thought was really was a good thing to think about when we were designing the lab. Now, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do about the collections, but I want to point out that Jeff, Pat, and the Mac Lab, we have a library, and it's got about 12,000 volumes, and it covers the obvious things like history, archaeology, the Mid-Atlantic, material culture, conservation. But the catalog is searchable online, and it's non-lending, but anybody can come in and use the library. So if you find that we've got a book or a resource that you would like to use in the library, you can just come in and use it. So I've sung the praises of how awesome that the Mac Lab is, and I've talked about all the wonderful things we've been trying to do to preserve the collections and make them more accessible. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the struggles that we've had and some of the challenges we've faced, and maybe dispel the myth a little bit of the Mac Lab as the great and powerful, because sometimes we're really held up on this pedestal, and I think to a certain degree there is a reason for that, but we've had some real struggles as well. And there are 3 biggies, and the first is the physical structure and systems within the building itself. As I've previously stated, aesthetically, the building is really beautiful. The design is beautiful, but in terms of controlling the environment, it was designed to look like a cluster of barns, and the interior actually, it mimics the conditions in a barn. I mean, you have these high peak ceilings and roofs, and it's really difficult to control the environment. And we also have an antiquated HVAC system. So we're hoping at some point we'll be able to replace that. And it probably wasn't the best system at the time when it was installed, and now it's 15 years old. So again, I'm just trying to reiterate our microenvironments. This is another reason, this is the main reason that we use microenvironments for the metals to help buffer them from the swings in temperature and relative humidity that we get in the hot and humid Chesapeake summers, which July and August can be pretty tough. But that's great for the smaller objects, but we have some pretty big iron objects in our collections that it's really, the conservators are really sort of at a loss at what to do. I mean, most of the oversized iron objects we've got here are part of a 19th century steamship engine that had been underwater for 150 years. And in the early 1990s, I don't think they would do it now. I hope they wouldn't do it now, but they brought up a large chunk of it. And the Mac Lab didn't exist yet, so it was conserved elsewhere. And they really did the best conservation they could. But it's just, most of it isn't even really iron anymore. Pieces are breaking off of it, and it's almost like a graphite inside. So as you can see, some pieces here are just falling apart. So it's just inherently unstable. And so this is one of my, I just go into storage in July and August and look around and see what pieces are falling off of it, So that's one of our biggest challenges. And we're just not sure if, we'll have to end up deaccessioning part of it. I don't know, but I think this is a perfect example of people needing to realize what forever means, because once they brought it up and it was accessioned into the state collections, we're supposed to keep it forever in perpetuity. But it's difficult if it's something that you really can't care for well. And I think this is this particular object or series of objects is something that we have a very difficult time caring for. And also, this is the roof, the ceiling in collection storage. When you walk into collection storage, it's really beautiful. It's like dramatic. You have this big space. It's so difficult to control the environment. So originally, when we were going to expand, put an addition on storage, their thought was that we would put in a third floor mezzanine too. And I said, you can't do that because we'll never, I think even with the best HVAC system, we'll never be able to control the environment adequately in that space. So I've suggested that we put in a drop ceiling and seal it off so we'll be able to have better control. And then of course also, if not upgrade, replace our HVAC system. And so we do currently have a plan to expand, hopefully within the next 5 years, because we're getting close to full. They'll put a little wing here, which will sort of look like a shed addition on a tobacco barn, upgrade our HVAC, replace our HVAC system, and then in the back of the Mac Lab here, there's a lot of open area. It's an overhang, and we're going to try to enclose a lot of that to expand space for washing and conserving artifacts, and also put in that additional space to house the records, to remove the records from storage, the associated documentation that goes along with the collections, give it its own room, separate space to be stored. So our second challenge has been the management of digital data, which is associated with the collections, and this problem is twofold. For every archaeological project that is turned over for permanent curation, it either comes with an artifact database in Excel or Access. There are dozens or hundreds of digital photos, and in some cases we even receive digital copies of the site report as well as field records. And the Mac Lab's current curatorial practice is just transfer those digital files onto our server and archive the CD. And unfortunately, with current staffing levels, it's virtually impossible to conduct any kind of regular inspection of these digital files or convert the current files to newer versions of these programs as they become available. This is extremely problematic as the lack of inspection or data transfer will eventually lead to the loss of important contextual information. And our federal curator, Sarah, loves to say we might as well just be storing them in a damp basement. We have this great facility, but we might as well just be taking the digital data and storing it in a damp basement in danger of flooding, because that's pretty much, we're just hoping, keeping our fingers crossed, that we're not losing data. Now, the second problem, part of the digital management problem, or I should say was a problem, is we used to use a program called Rediscovery for our artifact inventory database. And Rediscovery was great for storing large amounts of data, but it just didn't have the flexibility for being able to retrieve that data and manipulate it. And it's like, well, what's the point of putting all of this information into an artifact database if you can't retrieve the information? I mean, that's the whole point, is to make it easy for you to manipulate the data. So what we've decided to do is we just exported all of that information, all of the artifact inventories that had been put in during those NEH projects into Access. And just for in-house use right now. And we hope to eventually refine this database and make it easier to data enter old collections that's already curated at the lab, and also revise our curation standards to require all new artifact inventories to be turned over in a standardized format, which can be easily imported into a larger database. Now, about a year or so ago, A number of curators and archaeologists from Virginia and different institutions in Virginia, DC, and Maryland, and Pennsylvania met at the State Museum in Pennsylvania in the hopes of starting a discussion of coming up with a way to standardize our digital artifact inventories for all incoming new collections from our respective institutions and states. And Pennsylvania already has a really good set of requirements in place for digital artifact database structure and format. And so we thought, why reinvent the wheel if they've got something that works? And they require the use of Microsoft Access with very strict guidelines for which fields to use and the formatting of those fields. They don't dictate lexicon or terminology. Heaven forbid anybody dictates to an archaeologist what you call something and what terms you use. So they didn't even go there, and I think that's the way to go. I mean, people, they should be able to describe things the way they want to describe them. So they didn't go there. And they haven't yet created the larger database to sort of import all of these new databases into, but they're taking steps in the right direction. And our hope is that we can work together towards a mid-Atlantic model for artifact inventory databases, with all states requiring the same thing or something very similar, because so many contracting companies work within the same states. And hopefully you folks here in West Virginia, if you have any interest in joining the discussion, I hope you would. We haven't had another meeting since last spring, but I think we're due to have one sometime within the next several months. Now, the downside to all of this is that it requires bodies, it requires staff time. More staff time than most states have. Staff time to make sure that the inventories are being turned into the current standards. Staff time to inspect other digital media being received, like photographs and PDFs. Staff time to do data entry of the backlog collections. So this brings me to our third challenge, which is understaffing. Like I said, I'm pretty much it for the state curation program. It's me. I'm a full-time permanent employee, but my collections assistant who works with me is a contractual employee. She is full-time, but she's contractual, and if she finds a better deal, she'll leave because she doesn't have benefits and or leave. And so we're responsible, just the two of us, we're responsible for 90% of those 8 million artifacts. And then there's Sarah Rivers Cofield, the federal curator, who's responsible for the other 10%. And we can hardly keep up with the incoming collections, the research requests, rehousing backlog collections, let alone trying to tackle digital media management. And quite honestly, most curators, and I think most archaeologists too, we just don't, we're just not experts in digital archiving. And most of us are just out of our depth when it comes to this. And so I think this field really needs a new generation of digital archivists, people who really understand archaeology and archaeological collections management, but also understand the digital side of things. And I don't think of myself as getting old, but I've been in this job 15 years, and I find that, I didn't learn this stuff in grad school. And so I'm reaching a point where I'm having a harder time learning new things. So it's I really need sort of a newer generation of folks to come up, who are really tech savvy that can help us sort of translate some of this digital media for us. And I mean, I think we all know, I know I've talked to David about this, you're not going to find help in your IT program, your IT support program in the state. We fought tooth and nail to try to get help from our IT programs, and it's just really frustrating. But honestly, the main reason we use Access is because that's what they'll support. So that's kind of been frustrating. If we find any kind of other software, they don't want to support it, and since we're part of a state agency, we've got to go with the Microsoft products. Now, having said all that, there may be a solution to our digital woes, and that's something called TDAR. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this yet. It's fairly new. It's called the Digital Archaeological Record. It's an international digital repository for the digital records associated with archaeological investigations. It's still new, but but organizations like this may very well be the answer to the digital management issues facing archaeological repositories. They have digital archivists on staff who are familiar with digital data, or with archaeological data, and they do charge a one-time fee in perpetuity, just like we charge a box fee, a $350 a box for actual artifact collections that come in. Additionally, they do have a long-term business plan. They're part of Arizona State University. If for some reason TDAR was to fold, ASU will take over, the library will take over as the repository for the files, so they have a backup plan. And the Mac Lab's federal curator, Sarah Rivers Cofield, has applied for and received a Defense Legacy Grant to enter the digital records that we have at the Mac Lab from military installations into TDAR. And first and foremost, this grant is to test TDAR as a partner for the Department of Defense. However, I see it as a test case for the state collections at the Mac Lab. As a repository for digital data, we're not doing a very good job. So many records are generated in digital form, but we don't have any protocols in place to detect corruption or protect against files becoming obsolete. We at the Mac Lab are trained in analog data, and we don't have the expertise to build and maintain a digital data management system. And while TDAR does charge for inputting files, this integrates the data into a larger searchable database and ensures that the files will be migrated and monitored for corruption. This is the new curation crisis, and it's really time to stop acting like digital data doesn't cost anything. I found that when archaeologists turn over collections, it used to be if you took photographs and they were slides or black and white photos, you'd have a very formal photo log turned in. But now with the ease of taking digital photos, you can take thousands and thousands of digital photos. I find that the photo logs aren't quite as neat and tidy as they were when they were using chemical film. And I think part of it is there's just this ease of being able to create these files, but there doesn't seem to be the care being taken in terms of making sure that the information is recorded. So we're hoping, keeping our fingers crossed that maybe this project will be the answer, and it's something that eventually we can look into maybe adding into our curation standards, that this is where the digital data goes. It doesn't come to us at the Mac Lab to store. And I have a few informational packets on TDAR. I don't have many. I think I only have about 5 if anybody is interested. I have them out at the table out in the lobby. So I want to end on an up but realistic note. I very much appreciate being asked to speak here today, and I recognize that the Mac Lab is at times seen as the great and powerful and perhaps having the solutions for most of curation's problems. And a good argument can be made for Maryland being ahead of the curve when it comes to preservation of archaeological collections. But this may owe as much to luck and geography as to the hard work of those who designed the facility and those who have worked for the last decade and a half to preserve the collections and make them accessible. By comparison to other states, Maryland is quite small, which has allowed it to consolidate most of its collections in one location. It was lucky enough to not just have individuals with the vision to design and build the lab, but the political support necessary to push through its construction. Maryland's comptroller for 40 years through the process of when the Mac Lab was built was from Calvert County. He loved history and archaeology, and we know he was integral in getting the lab built. And all of these people were in the right place at the right time. And I'm sure, given the current fiscal situation, the Mac Lab wouldn't be built today. The Mac Lab is a wonderful facility, but at 15 years old, it's not without its problems. And believe it or not, it faces understaffing and resource shortages, just like any government institution faces. We also have a lot to learn from other states. As I've previously discussed, Pennsylvania is really ahead of the curve when it comes to tackling the issue of digital artifact inventorying. And based on this week's volunteer program here in West Virginia, We have a lot to learn from West Virginia, especially when it comes to volunteer programming, engaging the public, and collaboration with local universities. Other than the 2-month public archaeology program that we run in the summer, we don't always have the best luck at getting, or more importantly, keeping volunteers that come back on a regular basis. And that may have something to do with our remote location, but it also may be our approach. And I look forward to talking to the Mac Lab's director and deputy director when I get back about this program that you did this week, because I think it's really fabulous. So I guess the final point I want to make is that while we've significantly improved the conditions of Maryland's collections and have made great strides in making them more accessible, the Mac Lab doesn't have all the answers, and we look to learn from what other states are doing. And we need to be open to new ideas and approaches to collections curation as we move into the future. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
So much.
Sure.
Becky, that was very interesting, and certainly makes me think about what happened here this week and how many hours of elbow grease and how much time it takes to move things forward and get us up to speed. So congratulations on such a well-run and productive program that you have in place at your curation facility. Who has a question for our keynote speaker? Okay, it looks like all the way in back.
How has your organization made Native Americans part of your operation?
I'm just trying to think. We just went through a process with the local Native American groups. The Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab is part of the Maryland Historical Trust. And so staff archaeologists at the Maryland Historical Trust had been part of a working group over the last 5 or 6 years with the local Native American groups in Maryland. And essentially what they had done is they put together, there was sort of the Native American side and the archaeology side. And specifically to deal with burial issues and Native American human remains. Because we now have a state-recognized tribe in Maryland, but we have no federally recognized tribes in Maryland, and that has been very frustrating for the Native American community because they felt like they didn't have a voice in terms of trying to get repatriated human remains or objects back. So we needed to sort of come up with a plan on how to deal with that. And so what they did is they came up with this idea of this working group of Native Americans and archaeologists. And they had to all be in agreement. They had to come up with a series of things that they all agreed on. And if they didn't all agree on it, every person on the committee, then it couldn't be considered a consensus statement. But essentially what came out of that is we were able to technically, I guess I'm not supposed to say rebury, but the Native American human remains in Maryland are now curated in the ground on state property, and the locations are kept more or less secret. They're still within control. I'm still responsible for them. They're still in my databases. I still have to keep track of them. But because there didn't seem to be a path for us to ever actually repatriate the human remains that we had because they were considered culturally unaffiliated. We were able to come up with this. I say we, I didn't sit on the committee, but I was responsible for preparing the remains and getting the Native American groups, the different individual members of the Native American groups who came and helped to prepare the remains for burial. And that's probably the most, since I've been there in 15 years, that's the most I've worked with the Native American community. I mean, we've had some, in southern Maryland, it's the Piscataway that are most closely, physically, close to the Mac Lab. And we do loan artifacts to their museum. We do have, Jeff Pat has a American Indian Heritage Day. But I honestly think the thing that really improved the relationship between the Maryland Historical Trust, archaeologists, and the Native American community was this working group and getting the Native American human remains out of the dusty old closet, as they would like to say, and back into the ground, and so they could continue their journey. I mean, that's really how they saw that, and that has just transformed the relationships that we've got with the Native American groups in Maryland. And there's a hope that some will get more state recognition, but there's no way to know. I mean, technically, if one of the groups got federal recognition and they wanted to technically ask for those remains to be repatriated, we could go and we know exactly where they are. We could retrieve them and turn them over. But quite honestly, I don't think anybody's going to want to dig them up now that they've been put back in the ground. But that's probably really the best thing that's come out of that process and has improved our relationship with the Native community.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for your response. Who else has a question? Go.
Your Native American artifacts, are they primarily Lenape and Nanacoke, or what was your primary?
You know, I'm not sure I can tell you for sure. As a collections manager, I don't know all of our collections in that level of detail. I know that we have some Native American artifacts, different sites from the Maryland's Eastern Shore, which would be, I assume some of them probably would be linked to, say, like the Nanacoke. But there's some I'm not sure that we know, depending on their age, if there's an existing group within Maryland that we can link them to. And I certainly don't know that. I have to say straight up, my title is curator, but quite honestly, I'm a collections manager, and I know a little bit about a lot because we have 8,000 boxes, 8 million artifacts from Paleo-Indian period all the way up. So I might not be the best person to answer that question for you.
Yes, I want to talk to you about the digital archives. The Thomas Jefferson, Monticello, as the one for slavery, comparative slavery.
Yeah.
We have, when I say we, I mean Colonial Williamsburg have 2 sites, and I know Maryland has some sites there. But I'm wondering if what we're thinking of in the future, are we thinking of that we might have to have all these, we have like one for slavery. Do you think we'll have one for Native American, along with that big one that you just showed us, the DAR?
I honestly would like to see something more like the TDAR, that everything is in one place, that you don't have a lot of separate, depending on, whether it's African American or Native American or whatever. And that's what I think would be so good about TDAR. But again, we haven't tested it for Maryland to find out whether it will work for our collections. I mean, I think other states and other institutions have been sending their data to them. But I certainly would much rather have one location rather than having several. It just makes it easier to deal with.
Any other questions for Rebecca? Very challenging, and I think, as someone who works in Native American studies at WVU, one of the things that we're always working with to get across to our students is that Native people throughout time have been on migration paths. And this came out in Darla Spencer's presentation this morning, that tribes would move. They weren't always known by the same tribal names, and we have artifacts that go back to the Ice Age on forward. So I can appreciate what a difficult situation you can have with 8,000 boxes, and many of those being unaffiliated, unassociated items. But really applaud your work to involve Native Americans and involve the tribal groups in your state-recognized tribe as well. Okay, could I have all of the Panelists, come on down to the stage. We have something we'd like to present to you before we wrap up today. And let's have a round of applause, by the way, as we wrap up our keynote presentation. Okay. And Heather, could I have you come up and help with these, please? By the way, I do want to acknowledge I introduced Travis Henline a little bit earlier, and I want to thank Travis and his co-worker Bruce Cooey for bringing over the additional sound system that allowed us to have this cordless microphone and to go into the audience and pick up your questions here during this part. So my assistant Heather and I would like to, David, maybe you could give me a hand too. We have some certificates to present to our panelists. We'd like to take care of that, and we've got some gifts here. Now, of course, Darla Spencer pulled double duty this week, and so she was a part of our staff and in a consulting role with Grave Creek Mound, and so we presented her a certificate and gift a little bit earlier, but we have, Heather will help me present these. A certificate for Kim McBride. That's okay. What's that? That's okay. Yeah. Thank you, Kim. Okay, and this is Darla's certificate, and her gift will come a little bit later.
Okay.
Yeah.
It'll come later.
Yeah. Wyone Edwards Ingram. I do feel like I'm announcing graduates or something like that. Jared Burks. Rebecca Morehouse. Pamela Casto. Everybody have one? Okay. And then finally, there's no way we could have accomplished everything we did this week, and I certainly could not have without the terrific work of my program assistant, Heather Bowie. Here we go. Thank you. Oh, something else in the wings. All right. Here we go. Another person who pulled double duty this week. Thank you, Heather. Okay, so I think all of you have had time to fill out the forms that were passed around. Oh, Jim, you were not here before. I want to publicly thank Jim Weber, who's one of our volunteers. He was running an errand for us, and we'll have your gift and your certificate for you in just a moment. So thank you all so much.
I've got one more announcement.
Oh, okay, David.
Beth Patch, she's been
Yes.
volunteering for quite a while, 1 to 2 days a week for quite a while. And to go into our observation room, all about that. She's taken we have a federal collection from the Bulltown Reservoir, and in commemoration of West Virginia's 150th anniversary, she's put together a wonderful exhibit on the Battle of Bulltown. It's fully interpretive, and she also took a QR code where you take a smartphone and photograph it, and it brings up maps and so forth that ties into the National Park Service's Civil War website. So it's really a wonderful thing, and we appreciate all you do for us, and we have a gift bag.
For Beth. Thank you, Beth. We didn't see you come in earlier, Beth, so thank you for all the hard work you put in on the display. All right, well, this is the point where we wrap up the formal part of our presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed myself today and this entire week. I'm ready for a good nap tomorrow, I hope, good Sunday nap. Thank you, all of our presenters. What a fantastic series of presentations. Really learned a lot, and you've inspired us. So at this point, take a look around Grave Creek Mound, take a walk around the facility, say hello to our presenters. I'm sure some of you have additional questions and things that you'd like to converse about, so please do so. And we have Janine over here with the box. If any of you did not get a chance to turn in your papers, please see Janine. She's got the box. The centerpieces from our luncheon are available outside. If you'd like to take some flowers home for your table, please do so. The more the merrier. And thank you all for coming. Thank you all. Very much appreciate you being here.